My name is Caterina Brandmayr. I'm the Director of Policy and Translation at the Grantham Institute at Imperial College, and it is my pleasure to introduce the speakers of the next session, which I will now invite to come on stage. Dr. Fredi Otto is Associate Professor in Climate Science at Imperial and leads the World Weather Attribution Initiative. She will put the spotlight on the role of climate change in driving extreme weather. And we will then hear from Professor Joeri Rogelj, Director of Research at the Grantham Institute and Professor of Climate Science and Policy at Imperial College, who will talk about progress so far in tackling greenhouse gas emissions and what that means going forward for delivering on the Paris Agreement temperature goal. We will have time for a couple of questions from the audience after the presentation, so do make a mental note of anything you'd like to ask our speakers. And with that, I will invite Fredi to take the floor.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Also welcome from the scientist. I will basically pick up directly where Benoît Faraco just ended by talking briefly about the impacts of climate change today and where we are and what that means for the Paris Agreement and the COP. We do not have an inventory of the impacts of climate change. So we do not have an overview of what the impacts of climate change are today. So what I'm showing you here is just from my own work with my team at World Weather Attribution, the extreme events we looked at in 2024 and in the 2025 up till now. And what we are doing with my team is new science in the way that it wasn't around at the time of the Paris Agreement, apart from a few papers, but that has progressed a lot in the last 10 years, and that is attributing climate change or the role of human-induced climate change in extreme weather events. So what you see here, and of course I'm aware you can't see every single word that's written on there, which is not the point, but these are extreme weather events that occurred in 2024 and 25 that had big humanitarian impacts. That doesn't mean it's comprehensive. There will be lots of events that we have missed, but it's the ones we have studied. And in all the ones that have pink dots on this map, climate change made these events more intense and more likely. And you can see that the pink dots on this map are in the vast majority. So there are two events where climate change made the event less likely, which one of them is a cold wave, so that's really not that surprising. And then there are a few events where climate change did not play a major role or where we don't have enough data to answer that question now. So this means climate change is really everywhere and affecting every part of the globe and also every type of extreme weather event. So you see heat waves here, which is the obvious ones, but of course also heavy rainfall events, hurricanes, there are the LA fires, there's the big Amazon drought that lots of you will probably remember, typhoons in the Philippines, so droughts in all other parts of the world. No type of event is safe and no part of the world is safe. And that, of course, is now a global warming of about 1.3 degrees. So that's not even at the 1.5 level, but and very, very far still from 2 degrees and very far from the 2.6 degrees where we are with current implemented policy heading at the moment. So this means mitigation is absolutely central, but I will leave Joeri to talk about that. It also means that adaptation is absolutely central. Because in a lot of these cases, these are events that have happened now and that have, in many cases, tremendous impacts on people, impacts on ecosystems, and that we haven't adapted to. And in many cases, it is actually relatively straightforward to adapt to, and probably not in the way that most people think about adaptation, which is often also about building dams or technology, but a lot of adaptation is fighting inequality, investing in social security, investing in warning of weather events, investing in warning that is connected to early action, because that is often the biggest change between a high death event and a low death event, is whether there is an early warning and whether people know what to do with the early warning system. So there are a lot of things we have to do, but there are also a lot of things that are relatively straightforward to do and that we know how to do. We don't need to wait for some technology, and it doesn't actually cost that much, because in most cases, you need to invest in the capacity of a few people per country to run these services. It is a much, much lower cost than what we are talking about, the transformation and the mitigation, but it's still something that we need to take into account. And of course, there are limits to adaptation. In the Amazon forest, the droughts that are happening there already are so that people cannot adapt. In LA, the fires have changed so much that it will be really hard for people to adapt. Limits to adaptation is not something that is limited to vulnerable countries or poor countries, but of course they are facing the vast majority of it. And so all three pillars of the Paris Agreement are absolutely essential: mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage, to help people deal with the consequences that are here already. I'll hand over to Joeri now to talk about the mitigation part.
Thank you very much. Let me see if I manage to, there we are. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor and a great pleasure to be able to share some reflections with you today. As Ambassador Faraco already said at the beginning, the Paris Agreement was a pivotal moment to move our global economy towards a low-carbon future. However, the question I would like to explore with you today is what happens to the Paris Agreement 1.5 degree goal if 1.5 degree of global warming is reached. Under the Paris Agreement, countries aim to hold warming well below 2 degrees while pursuing efforts to limit it to 1.5. This was a critical strengthening of the goal compared to the 2010 target that was included in the Cancun agreements, which focused on limiting warming below 2 degrees. And that was because over 100 countries, for over 100 countries, a 2-degree limit was already implying impacts that were unacceptable to their societies, to their cultures, and even to their survival. So this led then to the inclusion of 1.5 in the 2015 Paris Agreement. So 10 years since the Paris Agreement, where do we stand? So let's look at the climate picture first. This visual, quite busy, but shows the latest update, which was published last week, of the Indicators of Global Climate Change Initiative. This is an initiative that uses the methods of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and updates key indicators of global climate change on an annual basis, simply by adding 1 year of observations. We look at more than 10 indicators. Trends towards climate stabilizations are colored blue on this figure. Trends in the wrong direction are colored red. The general picture already emerges, but let's focus on 3 that are particularly relevant to understanding where we stand in terms of 1.5. And that is by how much have we warmed our planet, how much of that warming are we responsible for, and what is the remaining carbon budget for limiting warming to 1.5. So in the top left, you see that over the last decade, global warming stood at roughly 1.24 degrees above pre-industrial levels. On the top right, you see that virtually all of it was caused by human activities. Currently, we are warming the planet at roughly 1/4 degree per decade, which points that within the next decade, we will see global warming at current rates reaching 1.5. This is strengthened by the information at the bottom, the remaining carbon budget for limiting warming to 1.5. The numbers have been reduced by 74% since the latest IPCC report was published in 2021 and currently amount to a mere 3 years at current levels of emissions. So the bottom line is that we are rapidly approaching 1.5 degrees of global warming. Meanwhile, the case for 1.5 is stronger than ever. The inclusion of 1.5 in the Paris Agreement was based on an assessment of climate risks that our society would be exposed to if warming exceeds 1.5. These risks are illustrated by these so-called burning embers figures from the IPCC. This graph shows how, with each increment of global warming, risks increase. So where the bar is white, risks are undetectable. Where it's yellow, they emerge from the noise and they can be attributed to human activities. Where it is red, they become of a global nature, and where it is purple, they become so frequent and so intense that basically the systems that this assessment refers to would be in a state of permanent decline. So here you see the assessment for unique and threatened systems like coral reefs, wetlands, and Arctic ecosystems. And you can see that there is a key gradient between 1 and 2 degrees of warming, making the case for including 1.5 degrees as a temperature limit. However, the more we learn, the worse it looks. In 2022, the IPCC updated this assessment. And what we find is that for the same level of warming, higher risks are now projected, or otherwise, risks are expected to materialize at lower levels of warming. This is not only true for coral reefs, but it is true for extreme weather events, vulnerable populations, the effects on the global economy, and irreversible tipping points. This makes the ethical case for 1.5 degrees stronger than ever. So this brings me to my last point, the legal and policy implications of global warming approaching 1.5. For adaptation, I would say very little changes. Adaptation involves the management of climate risks that we cannot yet exclude. For the past decade, current policy projections have been pointing towards 2 degrees by the middle of the century, 3 degrees by the end of it. And in annual reports by the UN Environment Programme, we provide an annual update of this picture. Meanwhile, the fact that we are approaching 1.5 degrees results in an intensification of legal and ethical responsibilities to act. Because climate risks increase strongly, countries are subject to strengthening due diligence expectations with regards to the prevention of harm. And this indicates that the magnitude and length of overshoot of 1.5 should be limited. Fortunately, the Paris Agreement already includes the elements required for this. First, pursuing efforts to limit warming to 1.5 implies delivering on near-term emission reductions, and with that, the magnitude of the overshoot will be limited. This is already mandated by Article 4.3 of the Paris Agreement, which states that countries' pledges, or their NDCs, need to represent their highest possible ambition. In this context, countries can also continue to pursue 1.5 degree aligned pathways, which would consist of pathways that represent their fair contribution from the perspective of 2015, the year that the Paris Agreement was adopted. Finally, the Paris Agreement also paves the way to reversing global warming. Reversing global warming requires sustainable and sustained net negative carbon dioxide emissions. And this is already an integral part of achieving Article 4.1 of the Paris Agreement. That article aims to achieve global net zero greenhouse gas emissions in the second half of this century. And achieving this would lead to a gradual reversal of global warming. This brings me back to my initial questions. What happens to the Paris Agreement 1.5 degree goal if 1.5 degree of global warming is reached? And the answer, which is also the title of a study we published last week, is the pursuit of 1.5 endures as a legal and ethical imperative in a changing world. Thank you very much.
We probably have time just for one question. Are there any, raise your hand if you'd like to ask anything of our speakers. There's a question here in the front.
Can you hear me? Very, thanks for organizing this. It's very important for all of us to be part of it. My question is, given the geopolitical risk and the geotechnological risk, which is ever evolving, how are we going to ensure that we're going to remain focused on the net zero 2050 target, and how we can ensure, because it's a global topic, not just a European topic, how are we going to ensure that we're going to take that forward given the geopolitical risk and technological risk we are facing?
Thank you. I feel like we will definitely address that question also in the panel later, but I don't know if either of you wants to respond to that.
I don't want to elaborate too much, but I think the imperative of keeping the focus is that the physics of the climate problem is not to be negotiated with. We understand that every ton of additional emissions adds to additional warming. We understand this leads to additional extreme heat and extreme impacts to societies, particularly to poor and vulnerable populations. So I think it also comes back to what was highlighted in the opening remarks. Disinformation is really our enemy here. Informed policymaking, and that is evidence-based, is really critical. If you deny a voice for evidence in your decision-making, then the focus will definitely be lost.
And I think if I can just add, what we have to do, and I think where we as Europe have to go, really have to step up, is to change the narrative about why we are addressing climate change. Because all the measures that we need to do to adapt our societies and also to lower emissions have huge co-benefits for public health and also economically. It will make poor people having to struggle less if they live in better insulated homes. And all these co-benefits is what we need to focus on in our storytelling, in our narratives about what we do and how we do it domestically. And I think showing that will improve the quality of life of the people, because that's why we care about climate change, because it affects people.
Great. Thanks a lot. Thank you both. You really put the spotlight on the scale of the challenge and reminded us of the urgency of taking action, and really set the scene for the discussion with the panel. Thank you for joining us. Please give a round of applause to our speakers.